Many people, when they think back to the warring countries of World War II, forget to mention Canada. But one thing that should not be forgotten is one of its finest fighting units, the Black Watch Regiment. Made up largely of skilled snipers, they were specifically employed to scout enemy positions and eliminate Nazi officers, thereby wreaking havoc on enemy lines. Because of their effectiveness, they were involved in some of the most brutal and bloody engagements of the entire conflict. For this reason, many of its members were never able to return home.
I don't know how I escaped with my life. I should have been dead. I'll never forget that. Never forget that.
Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell their forgotten story. Stay with us to learn about the amazing and ruthless experiences of the men of Black Watch. World War II broke out on September 1st, 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. 9 days later, Canada joined the conflict on the side of the Allies, along with the United Kingdom and France. While their contributions in the conflict are often overlooked compared to those of other nations, their role in many of the most important battles that took place in these dark years cannot be denied. It was here that one of their most renowned units, the Royal Highland Regiment, better known as the Black Watch, stood out. Founded in 1862, they participated in a huge number of battles both on local territory and in other parts of the world, such as Africa and Europe. Now, with Nazi aggression in full swing, they had been called back to active service. During World War II, their first call to action was on August 19, 1942, at the Battle of Dieppe. This was the first Allied invasion of the French coast, almost 2 years before Normandy. Around 6,000 Canadian and British soldiers landed in the port of Dieppe with the aim of capturing it. This action, however, was never meant to be the start of a full-scale attack. The mission was to hold the outpost for a short time, just to prove to the world that Europe was not as impenetrable as Nazi propaganda claimed. But the situation quickly turned against the Allied forces. In their planning, they had seriously underestimated the German troops. When they reached the beaches, they realized that their numbers would not be enough to take the port. Despite the efforts of the British Royal Air Force to defend their soldiers, German aircraft sowed chaos in their ranks. The Allied tanks were unable to get through the sand and became bogged down a few meters from the shore. After 6 hours, with casualties mounting, the commanders had to order a retreat. Of the 6,000 men who had landed on the beaches of Dieppe, approximately 1,000 were killed, 2,500 wounded, and nearly 2,000 taken prisoner. Canada had supplied 5,000 of these soldiers, losing 68% in this battle. The Black Watch Regiment was also heavily depleted. Of the 556 fighters who arrived in France, 200 fell to German bullets and explosives, while 264 were captured by the Germans. Only 92 managed to evacuate and return to the United Kingdom.
The Allies relied on surprise to give them a decisive advantage, but when surprise was taken away, they didn't have the direct or indirect fire support to suppress the enemy positions. Naval gunfire support would have made a big difference, but ultimately, I think this limited incursion into enemy-occupied territory was always doomed to fail.
Despite the resounding failure of the Dieppe operation, the Allies referred to the failed landing as a necessary evil. The mistakes made served to teach them costly but important lessons that would serve them well in the years to come. The liberation of Europe had not been cancelled, but simply postponed. As World War II continued, Germany's position was becoming increasingly weakened. By 1944, the Soviet Union had managed to repel them from almost all of its territory, and the Western powers had emerged victorious in North Africa. While the battles were fought mainly on the Eastern Front and in Italy, the Allies were finalizing the details of a new and ambitious operation. The time had come to carry out a new invasion of the French coast. The chosen day was June 6, 1944. In the early hours of the morning, thousands of landing boats touched the sands of the beaches of Normandy. British, Americans, and Canadians, including the Black Watchmen, were met with intense German machine gun fire. It was a bloodbath.
En el bote había muertos, había heridos, y había soldados vivos que gritaban: «Mamá, mamá, mamá». Todo el mundo piensa que clamas a Dios, pero cuando te estás muriendo, llamas a tu mamá.
Tens of thousands died in the first few moments of the attack. Despite heavy casualties and brutal chaos, the Allies managed to penetrate the German defenses and force them back into France. But if the fighters from the Western powers thought that the hard part was over, they were gravely mistaken. The Nazis still offered fierce resistance that greatly slowed the Allied advance. Every French village that tried to be liberated was defended tooth and nail by the Germans, who, despite being defeated, were able to inflict heavy casualties on the attackers. One of the bloodiest battles of the campaign in France took place at Caen. It began immediately after the Normandy landings and continued for 2 months. One of the objectives of this operation was to drive the German soldiers off the Verrières Ridge. Achieving this would open the way to the commune of Falaise, the next point to be liberated. The mission was entrusted to the Black Watch Regiment. Although they were known within the Canadian Army for their sniping skills, they were primarily an infantry unit. Now, they had to face a solid German defense, made up mainly of veterans. On July 19, 1944, the Canadians and British began a 6-day attack on German positions. But these offensive maneuvers were poorly planned by officers, and the Allied armies suffered heavy casualties. For the Black Watch, it was the darkest day in its history so far. Of the 325 soldiers of this regiment who participated in the capture of Verrières, 310 were killed or taken prisoner by the Germans. Only 15 managed to return to Allied positions. Since the disaster at Dieppe in 1942, no Canadian unit had suffered so many casualties on the battlefield. We have the testimony of some survivors, such as Jimmy Bennett, to put into words what they suffered in those terrible days.
You don't know what's going on. Guys could be getting killed 30 feet away. You don't see them. You don't care about them. You're talking about yourself. I could hear the guns firing, the shells, the bullets flying by. They're just dropping like flies in the grass.
Finally, on July 25th, after nearly 1,000 dead soldiers, the Allies managed to drive the Germans back from the ridge. But despite the costly victory, the Black Watch was in no condition to continue the fight. Due to heavy casualties, it had to be reformed with reinforcements from the British Isles before continuing its actions. Many of its soldiers, traumatized by what they had experienced on the front line, asked to be transferred to scout platoons within the same regiment. Perhaps they thought that this way they would be further away from danger. But they would soon find out how wrong they were. Their missions usually consisted of going ahead of infantry units to observe enemy positions. Those Canadian soldiers who could understand the German language were perfect candidates to take part in these operations. Many times, they would enter a town completely occupied by the Nazis just to obtain information, or perhaps take a prisoner for later interrogation. On other occasions, they were used as assassins. They would head to a forward position with their sniper rifles and search among their enemies for those in officer uniforms whom they had been trained to spot. Once they had them in their telescopic sights, they would open fire, then vanish before being spotted.
A sniper learns real quick that the best Nazi target is the one with the highest rank. You cut the head off the snake, and the rest of the division goes blind.
Thanks to these brave fighters and the rest of the Allied units, the enemies of the Reich were able to continue advancing into the occupied territory. After liberating Caen and Falaise, the next objective of the Canadians was to head for the Belgian port of Antwerp, from where the Nazis received equipment and reinforcements brought by sea. If they managed to snatch it from their clutches, the Germans would be cornered and without the means to obtain their desired resources. For their part, the Western attackers would obtain a position to bring in their own reinforcements, greatly facilitating the European campaign. After brutal fighting, the naval base was liberated on September 6, 1944. But Nazi resistance had not been eliminated. Battles continued along the Scheldt estuary, with the aim of completely expelling the Germans and thus clearing the way for the entry of Allied ships. Black Watch scouts were sent out behind enemy lines to observe their positions and came back with bad news. The Germans were everywhere. The regiment needed reinforcements, but that was the case for many of the units embedded in the front lines. The new fighters who joined were totally inexperienced and sometimes underage, who had shown false papers at the registration office. Even though these soldiers were not what many expected, they were employed anyway. They would quickly show what they were made of. Black Watch's new target was the Dutch village of Woensdrecht, but this time, the scouts and snipers were forced to return to the much-feared front lines. There was a shortage of men, and those available were still inexperienced. Many of them had not been trained for such missions. Even cooks and drivers were employed, who had sometimes never fired their rifles. On October 13th, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, the Black Watch attack began. Due to the German artillery barrages that had destroyed the dikes, the ground was flooded. The mud made it very difficult for the men to move through a long stretch of open country to reach the Nazi positions. German mortars rained down on the Canadian troops, killing anyone unfortunate enough to be in their path. The battle quickly descended into absolute chaos. The soldiers could not see what was in front of them because of the smoke from the explosives. They only heard the screams of their comrades as they were hit by enemy bullets. This is the story of Black Watch veterans Russell Sanderson and Jim Wilkinson.
It hurts. It hurts when you can't help somebody and you know bloody well that his escape route is cut off. The second worst day we ever experienced, we lost 100 men in there.
The German defenses proved too strong for the Canadians, and the attack failed. That day became known to the survivors of the Black Watch as Black Friday. They had suffered 145 casualties in total, killed and wounded. Of one company, consisting of 90 men, only 4 were available for combat the following day. All 4 commanders of the regiment fell victim to German gunfire. But although this offensive had failed, operations by other Allied units were more successful, and on 16 October, Woensdrecht was finally liberated. However, despite the victory, the men of the Canadian unit were in no mood to celebrate. The regiment had once again been decimated. For this reason, the Black Watch fighters again saw action mainly as scouts and snipers. Eager to take revenge on the Nazis who had murdered their comrades, they frequently volunteered for difficult missions where survival was not assured. This effort greatly contributed to the Allies' ability to regain the upper hand in the Scheldt estuary. On November 8, 1944, the last Germans in the region fled, were captured, or killed. The Third Reich lost its most important port, while the Western powers now had a key base for bringing reinforcements to the continent. Still, it was far from Hitler's mind to order his forces to surrender. He had decided to fight to the end, costing the Allies every mile gained with the blood of his soldiers. By February 1945, the Canadians had crossed the border into Germany. Battles now took place almost exclusively in the heart of enemy territory. During these engagements, Black Watch snipers were employed as support for infantry units. Their mission was to eliminate machine gunners, artillery crews, and anyone else who might threaten the soldiers' advances.
I was fully loaded. I had a bead right above his right ear. No mercy. You couldn't show it anymore.
The Black Watch took part in brutal battles in the Reichswald forest, one of the most fortified points in the German defenses. The ferocity of the Germans prolonged the attack for more than a month, but by 11th March, the Axis forces had been driven back. Despite the numerous casualties suffered in the months since the Normandy landings, the Black Watch continued to take part in brutal battles on the front lines. One of these was the liberation of the Dutch city of Groningen on the 13th of April 1945. It was one of the largest urban engagements by the Canadians in World War II, with approximately 15,000 soldiers on the side of the Allies. This was opposed by 7,500 Germans who were among the last elite units of the Reich, but by then, German morale was at rock bottom. Many of his officers knew defeat was inevitable and did not want to waste the lives of their subordinates in a futile defense. After 3 days of fighting, the Germans raised the white flag. The battle was over. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler, surrounded by his enemies, decided to take his own life. On May 8th, just over a week later, the Nazi generals signed the unconditional surrender. After almost 6 brutal years, World War II in Europe had come to an end. When the survivors of the Black Watch returned to their base in Montreal, Canada, they were greeted with a massive parade. But even though the fighting had ended, many were not in a festive mood. The regiment, famous for its achievements, also gained recognition for a much more tragic event. They were the Canadian unit that suffered the most casualties in the entire war, from Dieppe in 1942 to Germany in 1945. The sacrifice of these men, like that of many of their compatriots, is little known, but it should never be forgotten. We have reached the end of this video and we want to ask you, did you know the story of the Black Watch snipers? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.